Bonjour à toutes et tous. Good morning, everyone. Mon nom est Sameer Zuberi. Je suis le député de la circonscription de Pierrefonds-Roxboro. Il me fait plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui et d'agir comme maître de cérémonie. Nous aimerions d'abord saluer la présence historique des nations Mohawk, Algonquin, Huron-Wendat et Abacanese dans la grande région de Montréal, lieu de la Grande Paix de 1701. We would especially like to salute the Mohawk Nation, the communities of Ganasatake, Ganawage, and Akwesasne, who welcome us today with their usual hospitality and whose contemporary presence testifies to the richness of the historical journey of the greater Montreal region. La réalité des changements climatiques a frappé de près au cours des dernières années. Tout proche d'ici, les citoyens de Saint-Martin-sur-le-Lac n'ont pas oublié les effets dévastateurs des inondations de 2017 et 2019. Year after year, the park where we are today and the banks of the Rivière de Paris are subject to spring flooding. The difficult realities of climate change are being felt throughout the country. Flooding, wildfires, severe droughts. The impacts are real and are happening now. This means major costs, not only financial costs, more importantly, human lives. Fortunately, each of us has a role to play and can influence next steps. Cette crise planétaire nous oblige à revoir nos façons de faire et de modifier nos habitudes de vie. J'aimerais d'ailleurs vous présenter une collègue qui a bien entendu cet appel et qui, tout au long de sa carrière, s'est illustrée pour son engagement dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Sans plus tarder, veuillez accueillir l'honorable Steven Guilbeault, ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning to you all. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui dans l'arrondissement à Montréal, dans l'arrondissement de Pierrefonds-Roxboro. Alors, merci d'abord beaucoup à Sameer pour l'introduction, collègue et député de Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mes salutations également au maire de Pierrefonds-Roxboro, M. Beis. Et merci d'être ici pour cette annonce importante aujourd'hui. J'aimerais d'abord souhaiter la bienvenue aux participants et participantes au symposium sur la stratégie nationale sur l'adaptation, qui sont plus d'1 millier à se joindre à nous aujourd'hui. J'ai l'honneur de donner le coup d'envoi du symposium et de faire une importante annonce sur un sujet qui préoccupe tous les ordres de gouvernement et toutes les collectivités au Canada, la préparation aux impacts des changements climatiques. It's my honor to kick off the symposium and make an important announcement on a subject that is preoccupying every level of government and every community in Canada, preparing for the impacts of climate change. We have to look at climate action in this 21st century as a matter of both offense and defense. As many of you know, I have spent decades fighting to raise awareness and stop the pollution that causes climate change. And so today, as we increase our preparations for the many impacts of our changing climate, it feels like fighting a war on two fronts. We must do both. We must reduce carbon pollution and we must prepare for the impacts of climate change. And it's going to take big, coordinated and Team Canada effort to achieve it. Aujourd'hui, je m'adresse à vous depuis les berges de la rivière des Prairies, où des inondations se produisent de plus en plus fréquemment en raison des changements climatiques. En amont de la rivière se trouve le parc nature de Cap-Saint-Jacques. Il s'agit d'un ambitieux projet d'infrastructure naturelle qui est un bel exemple de mesure d'adaptation au changement climatique. Le parc, qui est le résultat d'un partenariat entre le gouvernement fédéral, le gouvernement du Québec et l'administration municipale, participera à protéger des milieux humides rares tout en aidant à créer une zone tampon naturelle pour réduire les risques d'inondations printanières pour les collectivités situées en aval. En 2019, notre gouvernement s'est engagé à investir 50 millions de dollars dans ce projet grâce au Fonds d'atténuation et d'adaptation en matière de catastrophes. Notre gouvernement fait de nouveaux investissements records au moyen de ce fonds à la hauteur de 3,4 milliards de dollars dans l'ensemble du pays, triplant ainsi les dépenses des années précédentes, car ces catastrophes sont de plus en plus fréquentes sous l'effet des changements climatiques. Jusqu'à présent, 11 projets au Québec seulement ont été approuvés en prévision de financement au titre de ce programme. Our Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund is supporting projects from Taber, Alberta, to Cowichan tribes in Duncan, BC, from Windsor, Ontario, to Windsor, Nova Scotia. These projects help communities become more climate resilient by helping prepare for and withstand the impacts of natural disaster. Right now, with Manitoba once again threatened by spring flooding, we are reminded of the importance of forward-looking and cost-saving preparations to protect our communities and our economy. Mais ce n'est qu'un exemple important d'une situation qui démontre bien le besoin d'une stratégie d'adaptation aux impacts des changements climatiques. Vendredi, le ministre de la Protection civile, Bill Blair, a annoncé une série de nouvelles mesures pour la saison des feux de forêt cette année et pour les saisons à venir, soutenues par plus d'1 demi-milliard de dollars de financement fédéral. Se préparer au changement climatique signifie également recueillir et partager les meilleures données et connaissances sur le climat, non seulement pour prévenir les catastrophes telles que les grandes inondations et les feux de forêt, mais aussi pour mieux gérer l'usure quotidienne des extrêmes climatiques. To the City of Toronto, for example, adaptation means using climate data from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services to reassess their asphalt formula to better withstand extreme heat and temperature fluctuations. The goal is to save money on road repairs, a massive municipal cost. Or take the hamlet of Arviat in Nunavut, who are using data from the same federal center to reassess their drainage needs for new flood protections to prevent damage, improve performance, and extend the lifespan of the storm drains. Every smart city planner, every forward-looking business person, everyone who is thinking about the cost to generations to come knows that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Adaptation really is a global story of the survival of humankind across the ages. With a rapidly changing climate, our government has been working urgently on the development of a new adaptation strategy. The National Adaptation Strategy represents a really important new direction for the country to go beyond climate change mitigation and tackle in a comprehensive and strategic way how we make our communities safer and better prepared for the impacts of climate change. The new strategy will establish a shared vision and framework with clear targets and actions to drive new investments and initiatives so that we build smarter, better use climate data, adjust our ways of doing businesses, harness nature, protect communities, and more. No corner of Canada is untouched. The costs of climate change are mounting in all parts of the country. That's why today I'm pleased to announce that our government is launching the public consultations on the National Adaptation Strategy, the big final step in making the strategy a reality. We're kicking off with a fantastic virtual conference. We're also launching an interactive web portal where you can submit your ideas and comments. We've launched a discussion paper that incorporates the feedback of many groups who've participated until now. Now we want to hear from you. We want to hear from communities and Canadians, from local environmental organizations and interested businesses. Preparing for climate change takes many forms. That may include something which seems quite simple, protecting the nature that protects us, so that a riverside park is designed in order to absorb heavier spring floodings. It could include constructing better insulated homes and infrastructures, or better sharing our data on climate and weather systems with local public safety officials, city planners, public utilities, who can better prepare for every situation, from snow loads to wildfires. Our National Adaptation Strategy will set targets, identify gaps, pinpoint needed areas for investment, and help make communities safer and better prepared to support a more stable and resilient economy. We will launch our strategy this fall, and we need input from as many Canadians as possible on priorities for action. La stratégie nationale de l'adaptation doit aller de pair avec la lutte contre les changements climatiques afin que nos collectivités soient plus en sécurité et mieux préparées aux effets des changements climatiques. Nous cherchons à établir une vision partagée et un cadre doté de cibles et de mesures claires à mettre en œuvre immédiatement à moyen et à long terme. Qu'il s'agisse des gouvernements provinciaux, des municipalités, des peuples autochtones ou encore du milieu des affaires, nous avons toutes et tous un rôle à jouer dans la création d'un Canada plus résilient face aux impacts des changements climatiques. Voilà pourquoi il est si important de lancer aujourd'hui ces consultations publiques. Nous en donnons le coup d'envoi par une conférence virtuelle passionnante lors de laquelle nous discuterons des possibles mesures à court terme. En marge de la conférence, vous pourrez présenter vos idées, vos commentaires sur un portail web interactif. Notre stratégie nationale d'adaptation établira des cibles, cernera les lacunes, déterminera les secteurs d'investissement prioritaires et aidera à améliorer la sécurité des collectivités et à mieux les préparer afin de soutenir une économie plus stable et plus résiliente. Nous lancerons notre stratégie cet automne et nous avons besoin des commentaires du plus grand nombre de Canadiennes et Canadiens possible afin de déterminer les mesures prioritaires. Le Canada n'est pas le seul à être prévoyant et à se préparer au changement climatique. Aujourd'hui, je suis très heureux d'annoncer que le Canada sera l'hôte d'Adaptation Futures, la plus grande conférence internationale consacrée à l'adaptation au changement climatique qui se tiendra à Montréal à l'automne 2023. J'ai également le plaisir d'annoncer que notre gouvernement soutient cette conférence grâce à une contribution de 650 000 $ pour aider Oranos, un groupe québécois spécialisé dans le climat, à réunir les décideurs, des scientifiques et des praticiens de partout dans le monde afin d'échanger sur des pratiques exemplaires sur l'adaptation. Our government is pleased to announce the support of $650,000 toward the largest international conference on climate adaptation, Adaptation Futures, to be held right here in Montreal in 2023. Together, we're going to ensure Canadians are leading the way in not just preventing climate change, but protecting ourselves from its effect. This national consultation will make sure we leave no stone unturned, no climate impact ignored, no community bypassed, and no fresh idea unexplored. Si vous avez des idées sur la meilleure manière de nous adapter au changement climatique, nous vous prions de nous en faire part. Il est temps de travailler ensemble à créer un Canada plus résilient au climat. Merci. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre. Et maintenant, je veux demander, Monsieur le maire, Monsieur Dimitrios Beis, maire de Pierrefonds-Roxboro, de prendre la parole. Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning to you all here present with us in this beautiful park, but also those of you that are watching in a virtual mode. Monsieur le ministre, merci de prendre la décision de faire l'annonce ici à Pierrefonds-Roxboro. Monsieur le député, merci beaucoup d'être là avec nous aussi. C'est votre comté aussi et c'est très apprécié. Vous savez, derrière, nous avons la rivière de Prairie, un endroit très touché par les inondations depuis 2017. Grâce à plusieurs mesures qu'on a mises en place, on était capable, même avec les inondations historiques en 2019, de protéger à peu près 95% de notre territoire. That being said, we know that climate change is a definite contributor to what we've had to live with as a community here that borders 30 kilometers of waterfront. And so what I see this strategy and this consultation being for us is an opportunity, not only for the stakeholders in the different communities that are affected by floods in this case, or any other crisis management that they have to put in place, as an opportunity for us to express and to use some of our expertise that we have so that when we do sit around the table, whether it is the leaders in the communities, but the citizens themselves, we will be able to contribute to finding lasting solutions to combat the issues that we deal with as Canadians. So again, je voulais être très bref, juste prendre le moment pour remercier le ministre et le député pour l'annonce aujourd'hui. J'espère que les gens vont participer en grand nombre parce que c'est un sujet qui nous touche tous, pas juste aujourd'hui, mais dans le futur et à l'avenir. Thank you very much to all for being here in this beautiful community that I am privileged to be the mayor of. And we hope we find some resolve with this consultation and this strategy, and we'll be able to find lasting solutions for all. Merci. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le maire. Et maintenant, j'aimerais céder la parole à Caitlin Power.
Merci, Monsieur le ministre. Merci, Monsieur le maire. Merci, Monsieur le député. On va poursuivre avec la période de questions maintenant. Donc, on va commencer avec les médias à Montréal. Donc, faites vous avancer au micro au fond, ici. Ensuite, quand on passe à travers les questions sur place, je vais passer la parole à ma collègue Sonia qui va gérer la période de questions sur Zoom. Donc, première question, first question, please just identify your media, your name, and who the question is for. Thanks.
Oui, bonjour, Zachary Goudreau du Devoir. Ma question est pour Monsieur Guilbeault. Vous avez parlé du Cap Nature Saint-Jacques, donc le projet de Grand Parc de l'Ouest. On avait investi une première somme de 50 millions. On sait que ce projet-là va coûter une fortune. Il y a un enjeu notamment en cours lié avec ça. Est-ce que le gouvernement fédéral, vous pouvez déjà nous parler de prochaines sommes qui vont venir pour le projet du Grand Parc de l'Ouest? Est-ce que c'est dans les cartons?
C'est une excellente question et l'un des objectifs de la stratégie nationale, qui n'est pas une stratégie fédérale, mais vraiment une stratégie nationale où on veut travailler avec les provinces, les territoires, les municipalités, les peuples autochtones et les autres intervenants, c'est de déterminer quels sont les besoins à court, moyen et long terme. Le gouvernement fédéral a investi près de 4 milliards de dollars au cours des dernières années en matière d'adaptation, ce qui est du jamais vu, mais nous sommes très conscients qu'il va falloir en faire plus. Alors, l'un des objectifs de la consultation et de l'élaboration de la stratégie vise précisément à déterminer quels seront les besoins. Et je pense que le gouvernement fédéral ne peut pas tout faire, mais nous sommes certainement prêts à contribuer de façon importante dans le cadre de cette stratégie-là.
Et on sait qu'il y a beaucoup plusieurs leaders autochtones qui sont là au symposium aujourd'hui. Est-ce que vous diriez que les communautés autochtones au nord, au sud du pays, notamment au Québec, communautés inuites, sont particulièrement affectées par les changements climatiques et comment s'attaquer à ça en tenant compte de leurs besoins, de leur situation particulière?
Vous avez tout à fait raison. Les communes. En fait, ce qu'on voit sur les impacts des changements climatiques au Canada, et cette réalité-là, on la voit ailleurs dans le monde également, donc les personnes les plus touchées sont généralement les personnes vulnérables, les communautés racisées, et particulièrement les communautés autochtones. Alors, c'est clair que dans l'élaboration de la stratégie, il va y avoir une attention particulière de porter à ces populations-là qui font partie, bien évidemment, de la consultation et avec qui nous voulons travailler pour le déploiement des solutions en matière d'adaptation, donc de préparation aux impacts des changements climatiques.
Merci.
Merci.
Bonjour, Stéphane Bell de la presse canadienne. Vous avez parlé d'un forum ou bien d'un sommet qui aura lieu à Montréal sur l'adaptation au changement climatique. Pouvez-vous donner plus de détails? Quand exactement et qui va participer à ce forum-là? Est-ce qu'il y a des leaders qui ont déjà annoncé leur présence?
Alors, Adaptation Futures, donc c'est, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, c'est la plus grande conférence internationale sur les questions d'adaptation au changement climatique. Il y a des experts, des décideurs, et d'autres participants et participantes qui viennent de partout, qui participent de partout sur la planète à cet événement-là. Donc, à l'automne, en 2023, on pourra vous donner la date exacte, je ne l'ai pas en tête, mais Montréal sera l'hôte de cette conférence-là, qui est entre autres organisée par Ouranos, qu'on connaît très bien au Québec. Alors, le gouvernement fédéral va travailler de très près avec Ouranos et d'autres partenaires pour accueillir ces experts-là et ces décideurs de partout sur la planète sur cette question. Merci.
OK, donc il n'y a plus de questions sur place. Je vais passer la parole à Sonia en ligne pour les médias qui sont connectés via Zoom. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Caitlin. Nous allons maintenant poursuivre en prenant des questions des médias sur Zoom. We'll now proceed with taking questions for media on Zoom. Par téléphone ou par Zoom, avant de poser vos questions, veuillez donner votre nom ainsi que le nom de votre média et identifier à qui s'adresse votre question. Et enfin, veuillez vous limiter à une question de relance. We'll soon start the remote question period. No matter how you join us via phone or Zoom, please identify yourself and your media and who your question is for before asking it. Please keep it to one question and one follow-up question. Notre première question vient de Valérie Gamache de Radio-Canada. Our first question is from Valérie Gamache from Radio-Canada. À vous la parole, please go ahead.
Bonjour, Monsieur le ministre. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais vous entendre sur ce que vous appelez un peu le nerf de la guerre là-dedans, c'est-à-dire que ça prend une vision partagée. Jusqu'à quel point, à ce moment-ci, il y a consensus avec les provinces sur le fonctionnement de cette stratégie-là? C'est-à-dire je dirais, je ne veux pas dire quand les shots, là, mais qui, dans cette stratégie-là, devient un petit peu maître du jeu?
C'est une excellente question. Vous savez, quand le toit de la maison coule, je pense qu'on peut tous et toutes s'entendre rapidement qu'il faut réparer le toit. Puis après ça, on peut s'astiner sur ce qu'on va manger pour souper. Et je pense que cette image-là reflète très bien la situation par rapport à l'adaptation. Sur la question de la réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, il y a des différences de point de vue au sein de la Fédération canadienne. Sur la question de l'adaptation, il y a beaucoup d'alignements. Les gens, les décideurs, que ce soit au niveau municipal, provincial, territorial et bien sûr fédéral, constatent les impacts augmentant des changements climatiques, les compagnies d'assurance. Alors, il y a un très large consensus et je vous dirais que la collaboration jusqu'à maintenant, parce qu'on a déjà fait des tables de travail l'an passé, là-dessus, la collaboration de tous les partenaires est très importante et très alignée.
Et puis, pour ce qui est du financement de la stratégie, on parle de 3,4 milliards, entre autres, là, dans le fonds d'adaptation. Est-ce que vous avez évalué combien ça pourrait coûter par année pour vraiment adapter efficacement les communautés?
Donc, le 3,4 milliards de dollars, c'est ce que le fédéral a déjà investi au Canada en matière d'adaptation, donc de préparation aux impacts des changements climatiques. Le but de la stratégie et de cet exercice-là de consultation, c'est de tenter de définir quels seront les besoins en termes d'investissement à court, moyen et long terme. Évidemment, ça va être plus facile de définir les besoins à court terme avec plus de précision qu'on pourra le faire à moyen et long terme. Il faut comprendre également que cette stratégie-là, ce n'est pas un document qu'on va couler dans le béton à l'automne prochain puis qui va rester comme ça immobile au cours des prochaines années. C'est un document qui est appelé à évoluer au fur et à mesure que notre connaissance des changements climatiques, que nos données s'améliorent, mais aussi que notre expérience de déployer des projets sur le terrain augmente. Plus on va faire de projets, plus on va apprendre de ces projets-là à travers le pays, plus on va développer une expertise qui va bien entendu nourrir la stratégie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Thank you, Minister. Our next question is from Laura Lynch. Notre prochaine question est de Laura Lynch. Merci d'identifier votre média avant de poser votre question. Thank you to please identify your media and who your question is for before asking it. Thank you.
Hello, Minister. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm with CBC Radio. My question focuses more on particular challenges facing some Indigenous communities. I'm thinking of the Peguis Band near Winnipeg and also the Ukbagajing, I'm probably not saying that correctly, in northern New Brunswick. Not only have they faced repeated flooding that's become worse with the effects of climate change, but they are also living on land that they were forced to relocate to. And so it presents kind of a special challenge, and I'm wondering how your strategy will meet those kinds of challenges.
That's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right. What we're seeing in many Indigenous communities is the fact that the impacts of climate change are directly related to the fact that they were forced to relocalize in, for example, floodplains. So this is certainly something we want to address with Indigenous communities across the country to see what are the solutions that can be put in place to ensure that this doesn't continue to happen, that we do not continue to victimize them as we've had over the past decades. Namely with these impacts of climate change.
I guess, though, that for both of them, they've experienced this for quite a long time. And in the case of the Peguis, they've been asking for climate adaptation strategies for quite a long time, years. And in northern New Brunswick, they've been forced to buy back land that they used to live on to try to move from where they are. What is the government planning to do in the short term? I know strategies are made for long term, but these cases seem particularly unjust. And I'm wondering what government can do short term to try to meet the challenges and also do it in the name of reconciliation.
Well, as you rightly pointed out, part of the objective of the strategy is to ensure that we find solutions with these communities. So it's not about what the federal government thinks should happen, but it's about figuring out what those strategies, what those solutions are with these Indigenous communities. And yes, the strategy is about the mid to long term, but as I said earlier, it's also about what can be done in the short term.
Thank you, Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Notre prochaine question vient de Mia Robson. Our next question is from Mia Robson. Mia, please identify who your question is for and your media before asking a question. Mia, merci d'identifier votre média et de clarifier pour qui est votre question avant de la poser. Merci. The floor is yours. Please go right ahead.
Yes, good morning. My question is for Minister Guilbeault. I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier that the costs of climate change are already mounting. I want to know what data we have on how much climate change has cost in some of these events thus far, and what costs we're really looking at going forward. How much is it going to cost to adapt to the reality of climate change in Canada?
Data that we have either compiled by the federal government or the Insurance Bureau of Canada or other institute that have compiled data show that the cost of climate change in Canada and around the world really are mounting. We're talking about $30 billion in the last few years in Canada alone. And I mean, in terms of what will be the cost going forward, we can do some forecasting, but one of the objectives of the National Adaptation Strategy is to get better data and better understanding of what those impacts will be. And obviously, one of the ways we can reduce the future cost of climate impacts is to better prepare. And that's what the strategy is all about. How do we work with municipalities? How will we work with provincial and territorial government? How do we work with Indigenous communities to ensure that we're better prepared so that when we are seeing impacts of climate change, they don't hit as hard as they would have otherwise.
I'm also wondering if we get mapping from flood maps or an indication that forest fire risk is higher, what role does the government have in ensuring that we lower those risks by moving people or moving buildings or moving communities so that they're no longer at risk and preventing communities from expanding or building in places that are at high risk?
That's an excellent question. And that's why it needs to be a national adaptation strategy. The federal government isn't very involved in urban planning, for example. Cities are very involved in urban planning, which is why we need them at the table with us, deciding on what the strategy needs to be, figuring out what the impacts locally are, and what are the solutions. And in some cases, the solutions will likely be what is being done here in Montreal, in the western part of Montreal, to invest in parks that will allow us to absorb spring floodings. In other cases, unfortunately, it might be about relocating people, whether in our municipalities or some municipalities or Indigenous communities. I don't think that there is one strategy or one solution that will fit all different cases, which is why we need to have everyone at the table working together to figure out what those solutions are.
Thank you very much, Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Notre prochaine question vient de David Turton de la CBC. Our next question is from David Turton from CBC. Please go right ahead. The floor is yours.
Hi, Minister. I'm wondering, our emissions reduction plan, of course, is mandated by legislation. You have to meet the targets there. Will you do the same for this adaptation plan, this adaptation strategy that you're putting forward today? Will you mandate that we have to follow whatever the plan outlines?
That's a very good question, and we haven't made that determination yet. But should we come collectively to the conclusion that some elements of the National Adaptation Strategy, which fall under federal jurisdiction, would need to be legislated or regulated, it's certainly something we're willing to contemplate. One of the goals of the consultation is to try and figure out collectively what are those targets that we should have when it comes to adaptation. It may, targets certainly seem very obvious when talking about mitigating climate pollution. They may not be as obvious when it comes to talking about adaptation, but clearly what experts have told us is, yes, we can define targets when it comes to adaptation as well. So that's the work we will be doing in the coming months. And if we need to take it a step further at the federal level, certainly something I'm willing to contemplate.
Consultations and strategies, they're not really sexy topics. They're not things that grab headlines. So I'm wondering if you can make this real for Canadians. Why is this strategy so important? What are some of the concrete targets that we can see emerging from this, from the strategy?
It's important to Canadians because we know we're already feeling the impacts of climate change. And we know Canada, like most countries around the world, isn't prepared to face the impacts of climate change. And we basically have two choices. We can either better prepare to ensure that less people are affected year after year, that less damages are happening to our natural ecosystem, to our municipal infrastructures and public infrastructures, that less people are feeling the impacts of climate change. And that's what we're trying to do, basically. And we need all levels of government. We need Indigenous people around the table, because no one has all the solutions. But together we can come up with the solutions that we need. And what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry, the later part. The latter. There was another thing.
David, I think.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, I just needed the conference person to unmute me. But what are some of the real targets that we could see emerge from this? Yeah.
For example, one thing we've heard from experts on targets is to ensure that by 2030, for example, X number of less Canadians are affected every year by floodings or forest fires. These are the type of targets, and they can certainly be others, and I'm sure we will hear others. These are some that we've heard from 5 expert panels that were launched in 2021. So these are the sort of things, and probably many other targets, that we will see emerging out of this, out of those consultations and the strategy.
We will now take our last 2 questions from Natasha Belowski and then Dan Spector. Nous allons prendre 2 dernières questions de Natasha Belowski et ensuite de Dan Spector. Natasha, please go right ahead. Please identify your media and who your question is for before asking your question.
Hi, thank you for taking our questions. I'm with Canada's National Observer, and I'm wondering, I know in the 2021 preliminary advisory table, there was the mention of a possible federal action plan to sort of accompany the strategy. And I'm wondering what level of detail we can expect from such a plan, and also what types of short-term actions, funding priorities and things like that would make sense to include in a federal action plan.
Yes. Well, in terms of priorities, as you know, we had 5 working tables that started their work with experts in 2021, looking at climate impacts and human health, infrastructure, disaster preparation. So these are certainly elements that we will likely see in the federal component of the National Adaptation Strategy, and areas of priorities in the short term. But I certainly don't want to limit the federal role to these, but these are already recommendations that we've received from experts on what the federal government could and should be doing.
Right. And in terms of this discussion paper, I guess I'm curious at this stage why there aren't maybe more detailed targets and responsibilities, in terms of naming specific departments and laying out some of that, because with only the summer left until we're expected to see the final version, I guess I'm wondering if it would have not been beneficial to be able to discuss some proposed targets and timelines in a bit more of a concrete way beforehand, because that's that's a big process, trying to figure out where the responsibility lies and when everything needs to be done by.
You're right. It's an ambitious timeline. The flip side of this is obviously that climate change won't wait for us and climate impacts won't wait for us. And we are playing catch up here. So we need to get this right, but we also need to act quickly. And it is ambitious, but I would remind you that we developed the emissions reduction plan, which was a first in Canada's history in basically 4 months, which included actions by at least a dozen different federal departments. So I think that we can do that. We need to do it and we want to do it.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Thank you, Minister. Our last question is for Dan Spector. Dan, please identify your media and who your question is for before asking it. Notre dernière question est de Dan Spector. Dan, merci d'identifier votre média et pour qui votre question est avant de la poser. Merci. The floor is yours. Please go right ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, Dan Spector from Global News. You sort of just touched on it, but Minister, how can you be sure this consultation will lead to actual policy change quickly?
Because I think we're all aligned in our understanding, whether it's at the federal level, provincial, territorial, Indigenous peoples, municipalities, we're all aligned and we all agree that we need to act, that we need to be better prepared. As I said earlier in French, when the roof is leaking, we can all quickly agree that we need to fix it. And then, about other things, we can argue about what we'll have for dinner later. And I think that image is quite right when it comes to adaptation. There is no debate about whether or not we should be better prepared to face the impacts of climate change in Canada. There are differences of opinion on how we tackle climate change, on how we reduce emissions. That's true. But when it comes to adaptation, there's a lot of alignment and agreement around the table.
And how are you going to measure the progress of the strategy?
Well, I think one of the goals of the strategy is to define very specific targets in terms of how we're performing. And I named some targets that have been proposed already by expert tables at the federal level, making sure that X number of less Canadians are affected by floodings in 2030 or affected by forest fires or heat waves. So these are some of the targets we could see in a national adaptation strategy. And then once you have those targets, you can measure against them and see what progress you're making in achieving those targets.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think we also have a question for Mary Walsh from the Globe and Mail. Please go right ahead.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to go to some of these targets that you are speaking about. For example, you just mentioned it twice in your remarks. By 2030, less Canadians are affected by flooding and forest fires. In the actual document, you say that you'll be able to restore normal life for victims of disasters by 2030 within a year. I'm wondering how realistic these promises are, given that all of what we're hearing is that things are going to get much worse before they get better when we address climate change, even if we do actually, for the first time ever, meet our emissions reduction targets. So can you speak to the how realistic these targets are?
Would agree with you that these targets and others that may be proposed through the consultations are ambitious, but at the same time we have an obligation to succeed. We can't just sit back and watch climate impacts affects more and more of our communities, more and more Indigenous communities, more and more municipalities, more and more of our infrastructures sit back and do nothing. So it's ambitious, but I think because of the fact that we are greatly aligned at all levels of governments and communities across the countries, and with every time I speak to provincial counterparts on the issue of adaptation, or municipal mayors or city councillors or Indigenous representatives, there's a lot of agreement that we need to sit down together and figure this out. No one has told me we don't want to be part of this. We disagree with the fact that Canada should be better prepared to face the impacts of climate change. And I think it is that alignment that will allow us to meet those ambitious targets.
Okay, and in particular on the promise of or the commentary around potentially relocating people. A lot of people right now live in floodplains, live in high-risk wildfire areas. So what are the estimates on how many people in Canada will actually need to move in the next, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever the time frame is that you have, in order to avoid being victims of these climate disasters?
Which is why we need to have all levels of governments and Indigenous representative at the table, because the federal government from Ottawa will not decide on, here you get to move and here you don't get to move. It's work we need to do with municipal leaders, with provincial representative, with Indigenous leaders to figure out what are, in some communities, can we adapt using measures like nature-based solutions? Or if we can't, then if the solution is relocation, how do we do that and who pays for it? These are all elements that will be part of the conversations in the months to come, and will be part of the National Adaptation Strategy.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Thank you, Minister. Is there any additional question? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions des journalistes qui se joignent par nous via Zoom ou téléphone? Alors, je ne vois plus de questions. Et comme il n'y a plus de questions sur Zoom, ceci conclut l'événement. Mr. Guilbeault, there is no further questions on Zoom, so this concludes today's event. Merci à tous.
Merci beaucoup, Sonia. Merci, everyone. Thank you.